I'm Derek Silvers, the guy who made the short film Before Your Eyes. This short film took 6 months of my life to make from beginning to end, so now I'm going to milk it for more content. No, I'm just kidding. Now I wanted to upload this kind of making of featurette, which will be kind of like a cross between a DVD making of featurette and a Blender tutorial. For the more Blender heavy sections of this video, I would consider it probably an intermediate Blender tutorial because I'm not going to be explaining every vocab word or button that I use, but I'm going to link to some tutorials that helped me a lot in the description. So you can follow those tutorials if you're looking for a better in-depth Blender teaching experience. This video that you're watching right now is going to focus on 4 main areas, which are my rough renders of this project, the main scene, and my random video selection process, the movie within the movie, what I would do differently now, knowing what I know. Part 1, rough renders. Alright, here we have my test renders. I'm going to speed up or slow down the video based on if I have anything to talk about, because there are a lot to get through. Alright, so you see this first one was just a lighting test, basically. I just was testing emission from a screen onto a fleshy ball while a watery texture flows by underneath. And that's about it. You can see that originally the screen was kind of a butterfly shape. I was just testing all different kinds of shapes for the screen and eventually just settled on a normal cinema theater screen, basically. Here's the next one. Now you can see that there's actually something happening on the screen. It's still a weird shape. And the problem with making the screen a weird shape was that you can't really see what's happening on it, hence the cinema screen. You might notice that in the screen there are 2 people. There's a mother and a father walking around, and there used to be a father character, but I cut him out because there was no need for him and it would have created a lot of extra work. You can see I'm also testing wrinkling using shape keys on the fleshy ball. Although it's not really wrinkling, it's just kind of turning into a brain or something. Here's the next one. Now the screen is a more normal shape. As for the weird colors on the screen, I just tweaked the hue of the screen scene a bit to make it kind of neon colored, just because I wanted to see how it looked when neon light is emitting onto the fleshy ball. And there are still 2 characters. You can see them better in this test. They're just kind of walking forward. There's not much else going on. And then the video inside the screen loops. Here's the next one. In this one I was testing a tube-shaped screen that kind of just wrapped around the main character's head. And you can see it's starting to look like a head, not just a ball. And I was kind of evolving the aging technique that I was using. He kind of starts as a melted face and then becomes an adult face. And now he's kind of melting, I guess. But I really just wanted to test shape keys and animating shape keys to do the wrinkles. All right, and from here on out, it'll start to resemble the final product more and more. You can see the main character's head looks more like a head, and he has eyes, and the weird colors are gone. On this one, I was also testing the length of the camera lens. It's a pretty wide lens here, because on top of testing the different shapes for the screen, I was testing the camera lens length. And like the screen, I eventually just settled on kind of a normal lens length, not a fisheye lens. And here's the first time that the camera zooms out and sees the whole tube and all the extra screens. I didn't yet put the swirling iris at the end of the tunnel or the tube. It's just kind of empty back there right now. Okay, I'm going to start speeding things up a bit. This is only the sixth test. The file name's changed a bit, which is why it says 1_4. And you'll notice I was doing these tests almost every day in the beginning, but they'll start to become more spaced out in days. Not much else to talk about with this one. I guess I added this cloud at the end of the tunnel, and the light is kind of blinking in time with the music, but I eventually removed that blinking because the music doesn't really have a beat, so it just looked like random blinks. You can see inside the screen I added an HDRI, and that's about it looks like for this test. All right, here's the first instance of actual scenery inside the screen. Here's the earliest version of the school, and you can see that the scene is starting to follow a path. It's kind of a shorter path than it ended up being. And here's the hospital. Often I would download free models from the internet to use as temporary models. So, like this bed here, I downloaded from some free website, but then I eventually remodeled everything myself. The internet models were just temporary. And the university is looking a bit better. And the wedding scene. The main character's head is starting to look much more like the final version. Alright, I'm going to speed things up even more, because a lot of this is just adding small details to the scenes inside the screen. Just adding tons and tons of small details over the course of all of these tests. Here the main character's head looks pretty much final. For the university, I used my own university, James Madison University, as kind of the model. So I just did an Ian Hubert style extrusion on a photograph of the main JMU building. It looks pretty good from afar. Right here you can see very quickly a graveyard scene. There used to be a graveyard scene instead of the funeral home scene. So you would have seen the mother's coffin being lowered into a grave. But I eventually cut that out because I would have had to do a nighttime scene to get the atmosphere right. And you can see here, it went by fast, but at this point I had cut the father out. So it's just the mother walking around. Well, she's not really walking, she's just floating down the path. She doesn't have clothes yet. Neither does the husband. The daughter is there. And here's a rendering error. It was something to do with geometry nodes. I tried to make the screens pulse kind of by animating the base mesh of the geometry nodes. The main character's face looks really dopey there. There's the swirling iris the first time, so that the tube looks like an eye at the end. And now the mother has clothes. This is my first time adding clothes to a blender scene, so you can see her skin clipping through the clothes quite a lot early on. And we also just passed the first instance of the funeral home scene. I had cut the graveyard and made a funeral home with just a long dark tunnel so that I wouldn't have to make a nighttime scene. And now the mother is starting to be animated, and her hair is turning gray also, and the husband has clothes. So doing all these tests is just a process of iterating many times with small details, and also just fixing bugs like the rendering bug in the tube. You can see I added the train station at this point with another basic train model that I downloaded from the internet, which is why it was neon green. But I eventually remodeled the train and made my own procedural texture for it. Here I started doing my method of adding random videos to the extra screens in the tube. And you can see the mother's face design has changed. I basically redesigned her to be a bit more cartoony so she wouldn't fall into the uncanny valley. Added a bunch more detail to the school. And added a proposal animation for the husband. And I remodeled the bed. Yeah, this is looking almost final at this point. All right, I'm going to speed things up a bit again because there's not much happening other than more and more detail being added. That weird blinking in the extra screens was a rendering error. There is something funny that'll happen coming up, and I'll slow things down when it's about to happen. The blinking is still there. Otherwise, not much to report. Alright, it's coming up. You can see how much noise there was in these renders because it's only 4 samples. Okay, here it is. First of all, the daughter looks janky, but then the husband just crab walks out of his pants. I don't quite know what happened there, but I think I was trying to make his footsteps shorter or something, and it just broke. Alright, I'll speed things up again. There's not much left. Yeah, everything looks pretty standard. At this point, I had added my own videos that I shot around Los Angeles to the extra screens at the end. And I was using my method of selecting random videos, which I'll get into later. All right, this is the last one, and it's done. Part 2, the main scene. Okay, here we are in the main Blender window. This project was basically two scenes put together. There is the main scene, what I call the main scene, which is what we're looking at here, which is basically just the head, the main character's head floating down this tube while the screen emits light onto his face. And the other scene is what takes place inside the screen, which is where most of the action happens. And I basically rendered that scene first, but then I used that image sequence as um, the input for the shader of the screen. And all of these objects are just parented to this empty, which I call the mover. And this mover just has a few keyframes on it to make it travel down the tube. If you're wondering how I made the character age, let's take a look at that right now. Here's the head, and these shapes attached to it are the armature or the rig that I made myself and parented the head to for the animation, the facial expressions. But for the aging process, I basically just used a combination of shape keys and drivers. So if you look at the right here, you can see I have 3 shape keys, including the basis. So if I turn off these other 2 shape keys, you can see kind of the default model for the head. And this is kind of like a young adult age for the character. And then I added a baby shape key and an old shape key, which you can see in edit mode here. And these shape keys have drivers attached to them, which you can see by the purple color next to them. And let's take a look at the formula for these drivers. It's been a long time since I've looked at the formula, so I don't quite remember my theory behind why I used this formula in particular, but it was just a bunch of trial and error of finding the best age progression. You can see that the variable is this custom variable that I created called old age, which you can see if you go into this menu. I think it's called the object properties, and scroll down, and here's the old age variable. So if I increase this, you can watch the character age or de-age, depending on which direction I push it. I just made keyframes for this variable so that it increases as the scene moves along. The reason I used drivers for this rather than just using keyframes is that it simplifies things. It allowed me to just use this one variable to control all of the aging process, because there are shape keys attached to it, but there is also a shader component to it, which you can see over here on the left. I made this bump node, and also it pointed it at the same variable with a driver, which basically increases the bump as the aging process increases, as the aging variable increases. So you can see the bump also increases, which creates this bumpiness on the skin. So it just adds a little extra to the wrinkles. To actually make the wrinkles, I just sculpted them into the face while having the old shape key selected, and then just kind of did the opposite with the baby shape key selected, where I just smoothed everything out and shifted some of the facial features around to make him look like a baby. There's not that much else in this main scene, but I can briefly go over this thing at the end of the tunnel, which is just the swirling iris of white screens. It just kind of swirls around to look like an eye. And I just made this with geometry nodes. It's just a bunch of white planes instanced to a geometry nodes tree. So it's fairly straightforward. The base mesh itself is just a cone that has been split up into multiple objects. So you can see this is the wide edge of the cone, and then as you get more and more toward the center, the cone pieces are narrower and narrower. And these cone pieces just have a few, or I guess just one keyframe attached that you can see right here that just makes them rotate in separate directions. And that's about it for that thing. Part 2A, random videos. The only other thing that this main scene has in it are the extra screens and heads that you see near the end of the short film when the camera zooms out and there are all these other heads and screens floating down the tube. And you can't see them right now because I gave them keyframes to hide them near the start of the film because they're just not needed. The main character and the main screen take up the whole frame, so you wouldn't be able to see the extra screens anyway. But then you can see around here the keyframes flip basically, and the extra screens and heads get shown. Now, the main thing that's interesting, or that I think is interesting about these extra heads and screens, is that the screens have different videos on them, and these videos are randomly selected. And I haven't seen any other tutorials talking about how to do this, so this might be the main thing you're interested in if you're watching this or if you're searching for a way to add random videos to a Blender scene. The most basic thing about all of these screens and heads is that they are instances that are part of a geometry nodes tree, similar to the iris at the end of the tube. And you can see the geometry nodes tree down here. It's pretty basic. It's just instances of a collection attached to a base mesh that looks like this in edit mode. So it's just kind of a cylinder with a tip that just gets narrower and narrower, kind of like a wine bottle. And the instances themselves come from two collections. Let's see if I can find them. Okay, screen copies front and screen copies back. So I just made a copy of the main screen and the main character's head and added them to two new collections. And on the main character's, on the copy of the main character's head, I just made a material that just kind of randomizes the skin color based on, well, it randomizes it for every instance, and it also randomizes the eye color. And the reason that I had to make two collections, one front and one back, was just that. Here, I'll turn on the second collection. Um, I found that when I just made one copy, uh, one collection, that when I made the geometry nodes tree, half of the heads and screens were facing the wrong way. They were facing 180 degrees the wrong way. And I couldn't really figure out why. Maybe if I played with the geometry nodes a bit more, I could have figured out why. But instead, I just hacked together a solution by making two new collections, one that faced the front and one that faced the back, like this. And then I just combined the two in the geometry nodes tree, and the heads that were facing the wrong way are now facing the correct way. Okay, let's get into what I actually want to talk about, which is random video selection. Here is one of the screen copies that is instanced in the geometry nodes in the background there. And in the bottom left corner, you can see the shader that I created for it. This right here, this mini screen actual.mp4, is the actual video that is piping into the shader. And let me show you what the video looks like. Here's the video. It is a very tall vertical video where I just stacked a bunch of 720p videos on top of each other. And these are videos that I just shot with my cell phone, walking around various areas of Los Angeles, and also my apartment, and it looks like driving down a tunnel. And the resolution of this video is 1280 by 7920. Now, the reason that I went with such a weird, tall video is that if you look down here in the bottom left at the video input node, I couldn't find a way to randomize anything about it except for the vector. I think this would have been easier if I could have randomized the start frame, but you see it has no input socket, and so I didn't know how to randomize the start frame, because if I could have randomized that, then I could have just made a very long video of myself walking around Los Angeles, and I would probably splice together a bunch of different videos and then randomize the start frame. And when they were instanced over here, then it would look like a bunch of unique videos. But I had to work with what I had. So the theory behind the vertical videos is that I used an object info node over here to output a random number into these three nodes here. And the random number basically chooses a video in the vertical stack to play on the extra screens back there. So what's happening with these nodes is that the object info node picks a random number for all of these screens back here, all of the extra screens that have this material. And the random number is from 0 to 1. And I think it has 3 decimal places. So it might pick, for instance, 0.023 for one screen, and then for another screen it might pick 0.719, and so on. So what happens from there is that this map range node right here takes the number from 0 to 1 and converts it into a number from 0 to the number that I have plugged into the 2 max socket, which is 11, because there are 11 videos. So now the random number is anywhere from 0 to 11, but it'll have a lot of decimal places still after it. Um, so this round node, it's a math node that I selected the round option on it, rounds it to the nearest whole number. And the reason this is important is that the video needs to be aligned to the screen copies. Watch what happens when I mute this round node. The video gets out of alignment, and you can see in the background, it's kind of hard for me to move the camera back there, but you might notice that all of the videos have gone out of alignment because the random number is not a whole number until it goes through this node. So then this random whole number from 0 to 11 gets piped into this divide node, which is actually another math node that I just selected divide on. And it gets divided by 11. And the importance of this node is what you can see after I hit the mute on it. This one screen copy looks fine, but if I move to the background, you might notice that all of the videos have become the same, which kind of defeats the purpose of this whole thing. So that's the importance of the divide node. And then this combine XYZ node just turns that random number into a vector so that it can be put into the location of the mapping node, which is plugged into the video input. And then down here, we also have a few nodes plugged into scale. And the one that's doing all the work is this math node that is set to divide. And again, you can see what happens when I mute it. Basically, without this node, the material tries to squish the entire video stack into the screen. So this just makes sure the scale is correct. And again, we're dividing by 11 because there are 11 videos. I actually tried to stack more videos on top of each other, but I found that with this file format, 11 was the maximum. And the other video formats that I tried couldn't even go up that high. Now, the other thing that I'll explain about the vertical video format is that the reason I went with such a tall video is that I wanted to simplify the alignment of the videos. It basically turns the random selection into a one-dimensional choice. The object info node is basically just picking a number on a line, and that line is the video. If I had, for instance, made a grid of videos, here's my grid of videos. This would be another possible video format if you wanted to select randomly using this method, but I'll tell you why I didn't use the grid, is that now you have to pick an X and a Y value to choose a random video. It's no longer just a Y value. And then both the X and Y need to be aligned on every screen for it to look right. So it just using the grid just would have been more complicated. And with that in mind, there's no particular reason why you would have to make a vertical video. You could make a horizontal video. It would still be just a one-dimensional choice, and then you would use the same nodes. You would just, instead of on this combine XYZ, you would plug this into the X socket, and then things would be fine. But since my video is vertical, I have to plug it into the Y. So yeah, that's my long explanation of how I made these screens have random videos on them. Hopefully you found it useful. I don't know how clear I was able to be because I don't feel like a natural teacher. But if you have any questions about these nodes or anything else, you can ask in the comments and I'll try to answer more specifically based on your question. Part 3, in the screen. So here's an overview of the screen scene. I don't know how much detail I'll get into with this, just because if you look at the right here, just look at how many collections there are and how many objects, and most of these collections have objects in them. So all of that is to say that it would take forever to explain every little thing about this scene, and this video is already getting pretty long. So I'll just start by saying that this scene is kind of driven by this path right here, which I called the screen path. It kind of goes in a square spiral, and the camera follows this path. The characters sort of follow this path, and the locations themselves are controlled by the path, by the position along the path, basically. You can see when I scrub through the scene that the locations appear and disappear based on where the camera is. It was kind of a method of culling the unnecessary parts of the scene that aren't on screen at any one time, because there was just so much happening. Like especially in the school here, there's just a ton of detail in the school and a ton of detail in some of the other locations. So it was just necessary to optimize the scene by getting rid of the locations that aren't shown. Here, if now we're in the university location, but if I turn backwards, the school has disappeared until I scrub backwards, then it reappears, and so on. You get it. The main method that I used for adding and subtracting the locations was drivers that are attached to the screen path, and more specifically this object right here, the screen mover. Just like the main scene had a mover that moved everything down the tube, this scene has a mover of its own that moves things. And certain objects are parented to it. And a lot of the drivers point to the mover or the path itself. I used two different methods for the drivers. There's a proximity method and an evaluation time method. For all of the locations in this scene, I had to build the location, add objects to it, and give each location its own collection. And then I had to instance that collection to the scene rather than just using the original itself. So you see, I selected the university collection right here. And the reason I had to do this was I couldn't figure out a way of adding drivers to collections themselves. The drivers had to be added to the instances of the collections. Here, if you look on the right, the university collection itself is disabled right now. If I enable it, these are the actual objects. And if I right click on this, trying to add a driver, there's no option to add a driver. So let's see, where's the collection? There's so many objects, it's hard to find. Yeah, here's the university collection, the university instance. And you can see here I can add a driver. Let's look at a driver itself on the university instance. The main driver that's doing all the work is attached to the hide from viewport or disable in viewports button. Let's look at the expression. It's a Python expression that is pointed at the eval time variable, which is a variable that is part of the screen path. Here's the screen path, and eval time is this right here, evaluation time. So if I change the eval time, the university should disappear, and the camera and mover are moving down the path. But anyway, let's look at the university driver again. This is a Python expression that returns a 0 if the eval time is greater than 54 and eval time is less than 381. So basically, if eval time is between 54 and 381, this expression will return a 0, which means that the instance will be viewable. So it's kind of a double negative because this button is disabled in viewports. So to be viewable, it needs to be 0. It's a bit confusing to explain, but it's, like I said, it's a double negative. If it returned a 1, then the button would be enabled and this instance would be hidden. I can't do that right now because there's a driver attached to it. It won't let me click. But anyway, then the other part of the expression is else 1. So if eval time is not in between 54 and 381, it will return a 1, which will hide this instance. Okay? So in the scene itself, to hide and show the locations, I had to time when I wanted them shown and when I wanted them hidden based on eval time, which became a huge pain in my neck because every time I edited the path, eval time would change, which meant that I would have to retime the drivers. So you see here, if I edit the path, I'll select a couple of vertices, actually 3 vertices it looks like, and if I change their position, then certain locations will be shown or hidden because the length of the path is changing, and therefore whatever calculation that eval time does is also changing. So every time I would edit the path, some scenes would break. So here, let's edit the path like this, and then I'll go to the camera view. And this scene is supposed to be the wedding, but you see it's broken now because there's no location. And there it just came back after I scrubbed through a little bit, because eval time aligned again. But now this part is broken because the train station. Um, so yeah, changing the path, and which changes eval time, just sort of breaks everything in the scene. So I had to retime everything multiple times. Because of all of this hassle over eval time, I wanted a method that looked at proximity rather than eval time. So a few of the locations use proximity, like the school is one of them, which I have selected right now. It's here. Let's look at the driver. This one looks at the proximity between screen mover and an empty object called school proximity. Let's see if I can find school proximity. Okay, school proximity empty. It's right here. So with this proximity method, when the mover, which is right here, screen mover, when this gets close enough to school proximity empty, which is this one, then the school will be shown. And when the mover gets far away, the school will be hidden. This method was, in a way, a bit better than eval time method, and in a way it was worse, for this specific scene at least. The problem with proximity method is that the path moves in a spiral. So when I set all of the locations to proximity method in their drivers, you would sometimes get false positives, because the mover, as it moved along the spiral, it would sometimes trigger, um, it would trigger a location that it wasn't supposed to, because at some points in the spiral, it was close to multiple proximity triggers. So both methods have their pluses and minuses. I think if I had a different scene that didn't move in a spiral, I would prefer the proximity method. The other thing that I can talk about is how I animated the time of day changes. And it was pretty easy. I just downloaded an add-on called Pure Sky, which I found for $1 in the Blender market. You can see down here in the world shader window, this is what Pure Sky adds automatically. It adds all these nodes. I didn't mess with most of the nodes. I just used the animation node down here. But you can't see what Pure Sky is doing in the material view, so I'll switch to rendered view. Pure Sky automatically adds all these clouds, and it automatically changes the sky color based on the time of day that you set down here. So I just animated that, and you see if I jump to different times in the timeline, the sky color changes. I don't know what's up with this weird black hole looking void, but luckily it wasn't noticeable from the camera. Part 4, what I would do differently. I think the main thing that I would do differently is focus more on the character models, especially the topology, and also the animation. Um, you can see the mother looks a bit scary here because not all of her hair is rendered, but apart from that, she looks okay until I go into edit mode. And it's the topology is of her model is just kind of a mess because I didn't know what I was doing. So this led to problems with the animation um, because it limits the facial expressions that she can make. Here, if I go into pose mode on her armature, whoop, hold up. You can see, well, I used auto rig to make the armature, but here, let's try to make her, where are the smile controls? Okay. So here are the smile controls. You can see I can make her grin or frown a bit, but I was kind of, oh, and yeah, things get really weird when you push the values too much. But anyway, I couldn't really get a lot of the expressiveness that I wanted. Oh, I think the eyes were also an issue here. So if I tried to make her blink, yeah, I think this is a better example actually. Um, so I'm controlling her eyelid right now, but you can see if I tried to make her blink, it just messed everything up. Things get really weird too quickly. Um, and this was due to me not knowing anything about topology when I modeled her and modeled the husband and the daughter and so on. Um, so the main thing I would do differently is just focus more on topology. Um, and I would also model teeth for the characters. I was a bit lazy. I didn't model teeth for them, so they couldn't really smile. They could just kind of grin a little bit. Whoops, what am I doing? Oh, these are, I selected the wrong bones. Here are the smile bones. I couldn't have them open their mouths or anything like that. So topology would be the main thing. Along with the topology of the characters themselves, I would also focus more on the topology of their clothes. Um, I made the clothes a bit low poly. And by the way, if you're wondering why the characters are dressed kind of in these weird shirts and pants that look kind of Star Trek-y or something, my theory behind it was that I didn't want to show them constantly changing clothes because the short film just covers a lot of time, basically an entire lifetime in less than 2 minutes. So the characters would have had to constantly change their clothes, and the styles would have had to change based on the year. So I just decided to make things easy and give people kind of this sci-fi uniform that would just stay constant. But back to topology. You can see even in this opening scene that the low poly nature of the clothes is a bit of an issue. Like right around here, it looks blocky, and here her skin is clipping through, but it's also blocky, and her pants are very blocky. Yeah, those are very low poly. Um, so I would just focus on the clothing also. The other main thing that I would do is not focus so much on details of the locations. Um, whoops. Because I kind of had a tendency to get lost in the weeds where I would just um, constantly add details to the locations, like the school. Um, it has a lot of nice details in it that most people will never notice. Um, I spent a long time on this locker shader as well, and a long time on the padlocks. Um, you can see here when I zoom in, there's an actual photographic texture on the locks to give them numbers. But anyway, um, most of those details aren't viewable by the camera. Oh, here was another thing that I was proud of, the fire alarms. And even better yet were the fire alarm handles. So it's nice to show off some of this stuff in this video. Yeah, this looks pretty good, doesn't it? But most of these details aren't viewable by the camera itself in the short film itself. So I think I would have tried not to get pulled into making details like this. I should have focused more on the animation of the characters because that was the difficult part, and I just should have spent more time on that than on the location details. But as long as I'm showing off details, I might as well also show off this IV bag because it's almost not seen at all in the film itself. Um, but I was very proud of it. I just took an image of an IV bag from Google image search and put it onto a model that I created of this kind of pillow like object. But again, I should have focused more on the character animations and less on this type of thing. There are a few other things in the film that I regret, but I don't quite know how to fix them. The first one is in the opening shot when the mother peeks down, her hair just kind of shimmers in a weird way that was a rendering error. And at this point, I should also mention that I used Concierge Render, a render farm, to render the screen scene. Um, because with this project, I had to render everything twice. I had to render the screen, then input that into the main scene, and then render the main scene. So to save time, I used Concierge Render to render the screen scene. And I have some mixed feelings about the experience. Most of the shots from the screen look excellent. Um, but this opening shot with her shimmering hair was just distracting to me, and I don't quite know what happened here, but I would rather fix it somehow. And the other thing that I didn't like about Concierge Render was how noisy the final scene, the hospital scene, turned out to be. You can see all of this noise. I think to fix it, technically, I could have just upped the sample count, but that would have been too expensive for me. I ended up paying $450, I think, to render the entire screen scene. Um, and I rendered it at 4K with 128 samples. I don't know what denoising Concierge Render uses, if it's just the default Blender denoising, but maybe I could have done something where I rendered this scene and the opening scene myself. For the main scene, I rendered it myself. I actually use e-cycles, not the default Blender. But again, I have kind of mixed feelings about e-cycles. It's mostly positive. I like the way that their denoiser looks, and it is fast. It's faster than default cycles. I haven't tried Cycles X yet. That hadn't come out by the time I was rendering this project. But eCycles itself works very well. My mixed feelings about it are the price. I think I paid $300 something for it. And the guy who makes it, I think, expects you to pay that every year to get updates. So it's just very expensive, and I'm not sure if it's worth the price exactly, especially now that Cycles X is coming out and hopefully becoming mature. Like I said, I think eCycles works great, but the price was very steep for me. Okay, so that about wraps it up for me. I can't think of anything else to talk about right now. Hopefully you got something out of this long video. It's the first sort of tutorial that I've ever done. Maybe I'll get better at them. Maybe I'll do more tutorials. Um, maybe I'll focus better. But if you have any questions about anything, if you thought I went too fast in some areas or too slow in some areas, you can ask any questions you want in the comments and I'll reply to them. My channel is very small, so I'm sure I'll be able to get to all of the questions. Alright, thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe and all of that stuff. I'm going to try to upload more videos, more short films, more tutorials to go with those short films, just so my channel can grow. I hope my next project won't take 6 months like this one, but who knows? I have a lot of ideas for ambitious short films and non-ambitious short films, so hopefully I can get a mix of videos that take a short amount of time and videos that take a long amount of time and that shoot for the moon. Alright, thanks again, and bye.